Good evening, everybody, or good afternoon, or whichever time zone you are. I'm Norbert DaCosta, President of the Toronto branch of the World Federalist Movement of Canada. I speak to you from Brampton, Ontario, a part of the treaty lands and territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit. Brampton is in the dish with one spoon territory. The dish with one spoon is a treaty between the Anishinaabe, Mississaugas, and Haudenosaunee that bound them to share the territory and protect the land. The dish represents the land, and the spoon represents the peoples of the treaty. The treaty is to share the responsibility of ensuring the dish is never empty, which includes taking care of the land and the creatures humans share with it. Importantly, there are no knives at the table. Representing the peoples of the treaty must keep the peace. World Federalists view the world as one society, embracing all of humanity in all of its diversity. We call for urgent progress in developing democratic world institutions, which are essential to assure a peaceful, just, and ecologically sustainable world community. Immediately following this featured event, approximately an hour from now, World Federalists will remain on this Zoom meeting to answer any questions that you, the audience, may have regarding World Federalism and the World Federalist Movement. Today, it is my pleasure to announce the launch of our lecture series on issues that can only be fully and effectively addressed by good global governance. Issues such as climate change, war and peace, international economics, migration, and equity and social justice for all of the human race. The first is this memorial lecture in honor of the late Justice Norman Dyson. Justice Norman Dyson was a founding member of the Toronto branch of the World Federalist Movement of Canada and its honorary president. The topic of today's lecture is a Global Climate Accountability Act. What will it look like? First, a few housekeeping items. At the bottom of your screen, you will find a chat button, which you can use to chat with everyone on the meeting. You will also use the chat feature to submit your questions. We request that chats be respectful of all others attending. Next on the agenda is a tribute to the late Justice Norman Dyson by Walter Dorn, the Professor Walter Dorn, National President of the World Federalist Movement of Canada, which will be followed by an introduction and welcome of our guest speaker, Elizabeth May, by our Toronto branch Vice President, Rose Dyson. Over to you, Walter.
Thank you, Norbert, and good evening and good afternoon, friends and fellow world citizens. This webinar is proudly dedicated to the warm memory of Norm Dyson. We in the Toronto branch of the World Federalist Movement Canada remember him fondly for his participation in our meetings in recent years and his service as honorary branch president. Judge Dyson served on the Ontario Superior Court until 2007 when he retired at age 75. He led a life that was dedicated to the pursuit of a fair and just society in Ontario, in Canada, and globally. He was keenly interested in the prosecution of war criminals. As the statute of the International Criminal Court was being negotiated at the United Nations in New York City in 1998, before the signing ceremony in Rome that year, he was our representative of the World Federalist Movement of Canada to those negotiations. And he wrote reflections on the creation of the International Criminal Court for Peace magazine. And here I'll quote: "With the safeguards built into the treaty to eliminate frivolous prosecutions, it seems almost irrational for countries not to become member states. But we have come to expect negative responses from rulers of countries that consider power, material comfort, and military might more important than the welfare of their own population or humanity in general." Here I add that his commentary might equally apply to our discussion on climate change and the new international climate obligations. Now, Judge Dyson was an ardent environmentalist and practiced what he preached. His wife, Rose Dyson, wrote, "To the initial bemusement and general mirth of many, long before it was fashionable, Norm was an early enthusiast of year-long cycling as his principal mode of transportation to and from his law offices and the courthouse, where upon arrival, he would remove layers of snow-laden foul weather gear to reveal courtroom attire beneath. That's the kind of person that Norm was, and you can really feel his sense of his dedication. A look at his life also shows a passion for sports and a graceful sense of sportsmanship and fairness. This includes time as football quarterback at Queen's University, where he also competed on the basketball and track and field teams. Later in life, he enjoyed tennis and sailing. He also liked to entertain, playing his baritone ukulele for the Royal Canadian Yacht Club. And on the other spectrum of society, playing the piano for the Out of the Cold program, which helps the homeless and poor during the winter months. I'll leave you with one more quote from Judge Dyson about the International Criminal Court and its statute, which entered into force in 2002. He wrote, "Without question, the ICC is here to stay and will provide a non-military resolution to serious breaches of international criminal law. Criminal indictments and prosecutions are slow, tedious, and unspectacular procedures. However, the effect on would-be criminals, although incalculable, will undoubtedly be enormous." So we have the same hope and conviction for justice and accountability that lies at the heart of our discussion today. Today, we are dealing with climate crisis, not mass atrocity. Although we may find that climate change is a form of mass atrocity if we don't find the ways to stop it. In both cases, we hope for new institutions that can bind nations and leaders. We can hope for the same International Climate Accountability Act as we saw developed for the International Criminal Court and the legislation in governments around the world that ratified the Rome Statute. And we're delighted, just absolutely delighted to have her here with us, Elizabeth May, to educate us more on the possibilities. And to introduce her, I'm pleased to turn over the floor to Rose Dyson. Over to you, Rose.
Thank you, Walter, and also for that very fine tribute to Norm. I know that he was a staunch believer in world federalism and a committed advocate for the International Criminal Court. So again, thank you very much for those remarks. He was also a great admirer of our guest speaker for her courage, her dedication, and commitment to making the world a better place. And of course, to most Canadians, Elizabeth hardly needs an introduction. She was the first Green in the country to win election in 2011 and led the party from 2006 until Anna Paul took over a few months ago. She has helped get 16 more Greens elected, both provincially and federally. In addition to her role as parliamentary leader of the Green Party of Canada, she's also convener of the Parliamentary Association of the Global Greens. She continues to represent the Vancouver Island riding of Saanich Gulf Islands in Ottawa, and she's a recipient of numerous awards, including the Order of Canada. She's taught at Queen's University in Dalhousie, where there is now a program established in her name on sustainability and environmental health. She's the author of 8 books, and she's married to John Kidder. And between them, they have 11 grandchildren. So over to you, Elizabeth. We're really looking forward to hearing what you have to tell us about a Global Climate Accountability Act and what it would look like.
Well, thank you, Rose. And I want to start by acknowledging the territory that I'm on here. In southern Vancouver Island, my riding, Saanich Gulf Islands. The word Saanich is actually a mispronunciation of the Indigenous nation on whose territory I'm honored to and grateful to live. So it's the Wasanic Nation, and in the language here, Senchothan, say Haishka Siem. Yes. Welcome and honor and respect to all of you for being here. I want to start, Rose, because I know it's such an honor to be the first lecturer. I think there's somebody not on mute, maybe. Can you hear me all
I
right?
don't think not. There's something wrong with it. Can I call you back? I'm on a Zoom meeting.
I just
Okay.
wanted to wait
Bye-bye.
a sec till that was on mute. Rose, I know we're coming close to the first anniversary. Sorry.
Your sound is gone.
No, I was muted by somebody else. I'm
Oh, okay.
back. Rose, I just wanted to say personally, what an honor it is to be the first lecturer in the memorial lecture in honor of your husband, late Justice Norman Dyson. And I know we're coming close to the first anniversary of his passing. So deep love and sympathy and gratitude that you would share with us that he was an admirer of mine. That's it means a lot. And I know he was involved in the international, obviously, as Walter Doran just said in the introduction, he was very involved in the International Criminal Court. And I don't know if you know the crossover there that my new leader, Annemie Paul, who's a remarkable woman. She is, of course, a lawyer as I was, but she was on the Office of the Prosecutor in The Hague at the International Criminal Court. So that's some of her background is really quite extraordinary for someone who's now leading the Federal Green Party of Canada. I want to start this conversation going back to my own roots in the Federalist movement. Actually, even before I do that, I have to say I noticed I always do this. I look in the participants list and I saw the Honorable Doug Roche there. I see a lot of people there who are colleagues and friends from the movement for nuclear disarmament. So I definitely want to make sure that I acknowledge that the work we do on global world federalism, work for peace, work in criminal court, we must always be mindful that we have a generation that's not as aware as those of us who grew up in the shadow of the mushroom cloud, need to be aware of the threat of the resurgence of nuclear weaponry, the failure of Canada to sign and ratify the treaty, which is now has entered into force to eliminate nuclear weapons. And that's another challenge that we have. But I know that the lecture today that I've been asked to deliver, it relates to climate change. But I wanted to acknowledge there's so many wonderful members of the movement for nuclear disarmament in this meeting today. I'm very grateful. So back to my roots in world federalism. It goes back to babyhood. My parents were very involved in the World Federalist movement. Through marriage, my uncle was Norman Cousins, who was, I mean, some may remember Norman, but he was the editor of the Saturday Review for a very long time. And he was one of the presidents of World Federalists back in the 50s and the 60s. So I grew up with the motto world peace through world law and working in many volunteer hours for World Federalists. And I adopted it as my own when I got old enough to really decide what groups I wanted to join. I mention that now because in the context of how we would have a global Climate Accountability Act really brings up the question of how would we have effective global world government. And I don't do things like bring slideshows and stuff and have images, but just in your head, I want to describe a political cartoon that will really set in place the context of the talk I'm going to give. So picture in your mind a 4-pane window shot, and it's got, each one has a desk in it, 4 desks, 4 corners of 4 panes. It's a political cartoon some time ago, and it had a desk for World Department of Environment, nobody's sitting there. There's another one, World Department of Peace, there's nobody sitting there. World Department of Public Welfare, there's nobody sitting there. And then World Department of Trade, and there's somebody sitting there. So when we look at why we had failed so far to address the climate crisis meaningfully, that political cartoon comes to mind quite often, because where you want to look to see where is the world effective multilaterally, where have we adopted agreements with teeth, they're in that little window of the World Department of Trade. which is why, and I don't plan to be partisan at all, but just to say Greens have been advocating for some time that we need to use the tools that were developed under the trade regime and use them for more appropriate goals, more urgent goals. So I'm going to go back and describe the differences between the development of the Montreal Protocol, which did work, now, and what happened later with other climate agreements that have not worked. And I believe this has, well, there are many reasons that it's been harder to address the climate crisis than the threat to the ozone layer. But in terms of the mechanics of global agreements, this piece I think is quite significant and not really discussed very often. So back in 1987, I was working in government as senior policy advisor to the Federal Minister of Environment. And the department, Environment Canada, was, by the way, a much more robust department then. It had its own scientists. It was very effective and had good, what we could say, core strength. A lot of that's been eliminated from many departments across government for many reasons. But back then in 87, Canada was really in the lead. Mustafa Tobel was the president of the United Nations Environment Program. Mustafa Tobel was the one who was within UNEP that the negotiations began to protect the ozone layer. Now, the science around ozone was disputed initially, but just like the science on climate, it wasn't much in dispute. It was the industry that disputed it. So initially, when they began to realize the ozone layer was thinning, scientists didn't know why. But then they discovered that these very stable compounds that no one had thought, they were fantastic for instance, delivering asthma medication to the delicate lung tissue, because these things were seen to be completely benign. Chlorofluorocarbons didn't break down. They were stable, inert, essentially. They were completely non-toxic. They were brilliant ways to deliver medication to lungs, or little holes to packaging to create styrofoam, or inhalants to keep refrigeration. They were miracle compounds, and the company that made them didn't mind proclaiming that they were the miracle company. DuPont, better living through chemistry. DuPont, this is all fantastic. So it took a while for the science, I won't go through all the pieces, but it took a while for the science to catch up with, guess what? They're so stable, they're so inert, they don't break down till they get to the stratosphere, and then they break down. And when they break down, they release a chlorine molecule, which works through ozone like a Pac-Man, like that old computer game. They just, for every molecule of chlorine distributed as chlorofluorocarbons broke down, each molecule of chlorine would destroy about 80,000 molecules of ozone. So fantastic delivery mechanism if you want to destroy the ozone layer. Now, Environment Canada scientists were out in front of all this with other world scientists, and they were also great at diplomacy. So working with Mustafa Tobel and the United Nations Environment Program, they began lining up countries. I'll fast forward because it's a long story. First, they got the Vienna Convention to protect the ozone layer. And then, as you'll know from international law, once you have a convention and it enters into force, you can negotiate a protocol to give it more effect and more precision. So the Montreal Protocol to protect the ozone layer had been in the works for some time. We had a lot of bad luck in Ronald Reagan becoming president. That was bad luck, but we kept persevering. And the negotiations took place in September 1987 and resulted in a quite phenomenal treaty that actually worked. Now, one of the key pieces here, of course, was the North-South divide. That remains a critical issue. Back in 1972, when Canadian Maurice Strong, was the Secretary General for the first United Nations Conference on the Human Environment back in 1972, some of you will recall that almost all the developing countries boycotted. Indira Gandhi of India was one of the few world leaders from the global South to attend. Brazil boycotted, everybody boycotted. Because I said, look, this environment issue is for the rich countries. It's not for us. So in 1972, that had been the case. And in 1987, the issue wasn't completely gone. And particularly critically on the ozone issue, You had the global South saying, look, we need food refrigeration. We can't get people fed before food rots. And it's fine for you in the industrialized world that created this compound to say we can't use it, we need it. So this was the birth of a principle in international climate law, but at that point it was in the context of any multilateral environmental agreement, a principle of common but differentiated responsibilities. In other words, everybody agrees we have to act, but rich countries are going to go first. Common but differentiated. So in the first round of the Montreal Protocol, industrialized countries committed to cut chlorofluorocarbon use and emissions in half by 50%, 50. Developing countries were allowed to increase their use of the compound because they used very little. They were allowed to increase by 15%, 15%. So common but differentiated responsibilities came out of the Montreal Protocol. The other thing that Montreal Protocol had was a very clear enforcement mechanism. So look, this problem doesn't get solved if only some countries do it. Everybody has to do it. We have to protect the ozone layer because if we lose it, we lose all life on Earth. Nothing will grow without the ozone layer protecting us from the sun's most dangerous rays. Obviously, we wouldn't be here at all. And as it thinned, we would see an increase in skin cancer, et cetera, et cetera. So how do you enforce this? Well, they decided that every country on Earth that was a party to the Montreal Protocol would be able to enforce it against any party that chose to violate the terms of the protocol. How to enforce it? How to punish a delinquent nation? Well, trade sanctions. So the Montreal Protocol built into it that if any country violated the terms of the protocol to which they were committed, every other country in the protocol could level trade sanctions against the delinquent nation. Now, since every country on Earth joined the Montreal Protocol, this was a very effective mechanism because anyone who violated the terms of the treaty would be effectively in an embargo. Nobody would trade with them, or they would be able to trade with them with punitive tariffs on top of the trade. The Montreal Protocol worked. To this day, the Montreal Protocol remains because some of the ozone depleting substances, in addition to depleting ozone, are also greenhouse gases. Most greenhouse gases are not ozone depleters, but most ozone depleters are also greenhouse gases. So incidentally, the Montreal Protocol became the most effective treaty we've ever had to deal with greenhouse gases. And it still is. There's a recent conference of the parties under the Montreal Protocol in Kigali, brought in a Kigali amendment, which deals with more substances that are ozone depleters, but are also greenhouse gases, and it's been very effective. Now, fast forward 10 years. Now, in 10 years in diplomatic and timelines and negotiating in the UN and development of world law, 10 years isn't long at all. But by 1997, when the same nations gathered to deal with another protocol, this one within the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, things had changed. Now, I mentioned earlier about the North-South divide. It's worth going back to the fact that the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change was adopted in June 1992, signed, and the negotiations ended in June 1992 at the Rio Earth Summit. Again, coincidentally, I mean, it was astonishing when you think about it, that Canadian Maurice Strong also was Secretary General 20 years after the first meeting in Stockholm in 72. Maurice Strong was chairing in 1992 at the Rio Earth Summit. I don't need to mention that obviously Brazil didn't boycott. Brazil was the host. So a lot of work had been done in that intervening 20 years to bridge the North-South divide around environmental concerns, to say to the global South, we recognize that for development to be sustainable, there's got to be a lot more equity going on here. So that was a key piece of making the Rio Earth Summit a success. We adopted the UN Convention for the Protection of Biological Diversity, and the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change in 1992. And 5 years later, we were in Kyoto, Japan. I wasn't personally there, I sent my climate campaigner, but the world was there in 1992 and in 1997 in Kyoto for the first protocol to protect the climate. So we still had the principle out of the Montreal Protocol. The Montreal Protocol was the architecture for the Kyoto Protocol. So the Ozone international law piece became a model for how to negotiate a climate international law piece. Common but differentiated responsibilities underlined the Kyoto Agreement, as we all would know when you think about it. I mean, it was one of the things that was later used as an attack on Kyoto, was this notion of industrialized countries go first. We're the wealthy ones, we're industrialized, we created the problem, and we're much better placed to create and fund the solutions. So just like in Montreal in 87, Kyoto Protocol in 97 said industrialized countries go first, but all countries were part of the agreement. That was one of the things that got distorted by the George Bushes and Stephen Harpers of the world, was to say, well, it's unfair. I mean, imagine that a global agreement is unfair to the wealthy, rich, and industrialized countries because we have to do something first because we created the problem. Yeah, but all of the global South was also signatory and ratified the Kyoto Protocol. It's just that they didn't have obligations in the first iteration. And again, reflecting back on the Montreal Protocol, developing countries joined in and were allowed to increase emissions. The Kyoto Protocol said developing countries join in and also pledge to decrease emissions, pledge to do so, but without the specific commitments X% by X year, which countries that were industrialized and wealthy committed to do. But how do you enforce the treaty? And this is the key piece of the 4 windows that I described. Which desk has someone sitting at it? Which desk has a hammer? Between the Montreal Protocol in 1987 and the Kyoto Protocol in 1997, the Uruguay round of negotiations to update the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, the GATT, concluded with the formation of the World Trade Organization. The World Trade Organization created a committee on trade and the environment. This was not a good thing, because the Committee on Trade and the Environment, it would have been a good thing if they'd said, our mandate here is to figure out, are there any trade agreements that hurt the global environment? It could have been useful. They instead asked the question, are there any environmental, multilateral environment agreements? Are there any environment treaties out there that hurt trade? And then they thought, I bet there are. That Montreal Protocol, they can use trade sanctions to enforce protection, or the Convention on the International Trade in Endangered Species, using trade rules to protect endangered species. Oh, there's also the Basel Convention. Basel says if you're exporting hazardous wastes, you can have a trade sanction used against you. So the World Trade Organization, and this is fascinating, they never even made a ruling. All they did was ask the question. So I figure around every cabinet table everywhere on the planet, all the same countries that had just committed at Rio to reduce emissions of greenhouse gases to avoid the point where they become dangerous. Suddenly, every trade minister at the cabinet table is looking over at every environment minister at every cabinet table and saying, no, 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 no more of that. They didn't make a ruling. All I know is that a wonderful environment minister from Canada, who many of you will remember, the late Christine Stewart, who lived in Port Hope, Ontario, Christine went off to Kyoto saying, if that agreement includes trade sanctions, Canada won't sign. Now, Canada was the innovator around many, as I said, in Montreal Protocol in 87, our scientists, our diplomats, our negotiating skills, working hand in glove with the United Nations Environment Program, developed a protocol that worked. And by only 10 years later, we decided not to do that anymore. I think that's a big part of the tragedy. And if we look now, how would we develop global climate accountability? I think we have to dust off the tools that we developed that work so well for protecting intellectual property, for example. Now, lately, it's been much in the news, and I'm ashamed that Canada is still dragging our feet while Joe Biden and the United States government, of all countries and all governments, to say that we are prepared to exempt patent protection for vaccines for COVID. Well, the only reason we have such strict rules and it's so hard to get generic drugs to the global south is because in the course of the Uruguay round and in the creation of the World Trade Organization, a great deal of attention was paid to how do we protect intellectual property rights. Steve Schreibman, who's a wonderful trade lawyer and has done a lot of wonderful work over the years, but Steve Schreibman said, I don't know how many years ago now, because I wasn't in the Green Party, at a speech where he said, look, if the world cared as much about climate as it cares about intellectual property rights, well, the climate crisis would have been solved. I mean, intellectual property rights, if you're going out to protect them, the TRIPS agreement says anybody crossing a border, you don't need any even reasonable probable grounds for search and seizure. Open their trunk. Any pirated CDs in there, seize them. Guys in jail. There are so many teeth in the TRIPS agreement. The notion that these tools for enforcing climate law are hard to find is only because we're not looking in the right place. We've got all the tools we need to enforce climate laws, but we're not allowed to use them because they're exclusively for protecting things like intellectual property and trade advantages and patents and you name it. Those laws are used against climate, as when Canada said that India deciding to have protectionist measures for its solar industry offended Canada's rights under the WTO rules. So we sue India to make it harder for India to use solar at the very time that we should be doing everything we possibly can to make it easier for India to use solar instead of coal. We use tariff protections in Canada. We don't like the fact that China can sell us solar panels so cheaply, so the government of Canada applies tariffs against China for the importation of solar panels to Canada. So you look at the intellectual trade rules and you wonder, well, why is it that we finished all of this negotiation every single time, whether Kyoto or Copenhagen, which was a useless agreement anyway, or Paris, we have no way to enforce any of those treaties. We say they are legally binding, and the only enforcement mechanism we have in the Paris Agreement is group shaming, public shaming, with what's called in the Paris Agreement. It's a hard to gobble word, and I like the English language. I love the English language, so forgive me for this. It's called a global stock take. So it's starting in 2023 is the first global stock take under Paris, and we will be held up to global approbation because we're doing so badly as a country, and it's only 2 years away. And the Minister of Environment and Environment Canada want to pretend it's not there in the Paris Agreement. I don't know how they can pretend it's not there. They can Google it and find it, but it's amazing how easy it is for politicians and I'm afraid civil servants as well to pretend things aren't there in what we've promised to do. Now, it doesn't seem right. And as you said in the introduction, Walter, the threat of the climate crisis is not an environmental threat. President Biden, amazingly enough, I'm astonished by this. He seems to actually be keeping his campaign promises. No wonder Justin Trudeau is offended by the things that Joe Biden is doing, because he understands he made a pledge and he's actually living up to it. So his first executive order, or one of his first executive orders, canceled the Keystone Pipeline. Now, President Joe Biden made it very clear between when the election and the electoral results were confirmed and when he was sworn in, the moment that he appointed John Kerry, it became very clear that President Joe Biden understands the climate emergency in a way that our government simply doesn't. And that's because the Biden administration is not framing climate as an environmental problem. It's a national security threat. So John Kerry is on the President's National Security Council, and they said very explicitly in appointing John Kerry that he is there because the climate crisis, the climate emergency, is a security threat. And it's seen through that lens. It's not down to the administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency to deal with climate. It's a whole of government approach, and it's very different. So it's been the case, and I'll stop soon because I'd really like to have this open up to a discussion and questions and so on. If we want a Global Accountability Act, we have to dust off the tools that are held in the hands of the trade ministers. There are no rules against us having those tools. But I've said since Kyoto that it's as though the climate negotiator, the real negotiators, the business of government, the real tools, the agreements with teeth, are in the hands of the trade ministers. They are given the skill saws, the buzz saws, the workbenches where you get things done. And the climate negotiators are given those pretty pink plastic scissors that you get to give the children in Sunday school so they don't hurt themselves. We have not been given real tools to construct agreements that can possibly work to protect the global environment, to protect our global security, to ensure that we have a livable biosphere in 2050. That's at risk right now. A livable biosphere is at risk right now. And if we blow by the Paris Agreement target to hold to 1.5 degrees Celsius as an average global temperature above what the average global temperature was before the Industrial Revolution, complicated, horrible target, takes that long to express the full aspect of hold to no more than as far below 2 degrees as possible, and preferably hold to 1.5 degrees Celsius global average temperature as compared to the global average temperature before the Industrial Revolution began. If we blow by 1.5 degrees or blow by 2, we're on track right now to 3 to 4 degrees global average temperature increase. There's a very significant risk, almost a certainty, that human civilization will not be able to withstand the numbers of changes that occur in our global environment. And that's why we said for a very, very long time, since actually it was the opening statement of the consensus scientific statement from the June 1988 conference that took place in Toronto, is, quote, humanity is conducting an unintended, uncontrolled, globally pervasive experiment whose ultimate consequences could be second only to global nuclear war. So those are the twin threats to our complete annihilation: global nuclear war, runaway global warming. We haven't protected ourselves against either. We can still protect ourselves against both, but we seem to be distracted. And we seem to have a government in Canada that believes we can build pipelines and spend public money, $17 billion of our own money, to build a climate destroying pipeline because, well, we don't want to upset who? Alberta? Yes, we don't want to upset Alberta. So we make sure that Alberta goes along because the investments in renewables are better for their economy, and actually prove it and do it. Don't just say it as if it's an airy-fairy statement, but do it. But say just as clearly as that we must dismantle the nuclear arsenals, we must dismantle fossil fuels. And we need every country on earth to do it. So let's do it globally. Let's make a pact. Let's reconstruct the World Trade Organization as the World Trade and Climate Organization. Reorganize its priorities and get to work on making sure that we dismantle TRIPS enough to ensure global vaccines without patent protection, and enable and empower the use of shared tools with the goal of shared sustainability, a future that we can believe in. I'm 66 now. I hope I've got a bunch more years, but I'm getting nervous about making sure I don't shuffle off this mortal coil to leave my grandkids with this mess. I will not do that. So, of course, I don't control my own mortality, but I'm not comfortable with how much landing room we have left. We don't have any runway left for any more governments that procrastinate. And it's time to name the problem. With a Global Accountability Act, we have constructed only one branch of global world government, and it's that promotes the profits and the greed of transnational corporations to the detriment of human well-being and our survival. Thanks.
Elizabeth, that was wonderful. And I think Norbert is now going to handle the Q&A. Right, Norbert?
That's right. First, I'd like to thank you, Elizabeth. That was spellbinding, I thought. And you don't need a PowerPoint to make some pretty powerful points without it. Folks, please put your questions in the chat channel. John Cohen, who's our secretary, will be assembling them, putting them together, and forwarding them to me, so I get to ask Rose the question. Elizabeth the question. So the first one is, how do we link national security, nuclear weapons, etc., with climate?
Well, there's one link, of course, that the military industrial complex, and particularly the world's military, gets let off the hook on greenhouse gas emissions, and we tend to not pay attention to the military as a source of greenhouse gases. But really, the link is one of what threatens our survival, humanity's survival, and the notion of actually civilization survival is threatened by two things only that actually could take us out. I mean, COVID is a walk in the park compared to climate crisis. For one thing, I've lost friends in COVID, so I will not make light of it. I've lost friends who died of COVID. My stepdaughter and my two grandkids recently recovered from COVID. I'm not making light of it, but compared to a global climate emergency, COVID is nothing. It's only killing humans. It doesn't threaten whole ecosystems. It doesn't mean we won't be able to grow our own food. We won't, the climate emergency is a threat to our survival in a way that COVID isn't. And nuclear weapons remain a threat to our survival in a way that any pandemic could never be. So, and in both cases, the only thing stopping us from protecting ourselves from nuclear proliferation and nuclear war, and the only thing in the way of climate action, is a failure of political will. And that was the conclusion, by the way, of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change in their October 2018 report on how to hold to 1.5 degrees. They said, we can still hold to 1.5 degrees, and it won't be easy. It'll require Herculean efforts in all parts of our economy. We may not be able to do it, but we've got a fighting chance if we start now, they said in 2018. And if we stop using fossil fuels and make it very clear that we're going to be at net zero by 2050, but the IPCC made it really clear that we can't get to hold to 1.5 without more than cutting in half emissions of greenhouse gases against 2005 levels, and do it by 2030. So this notion that we have now in Canada and other countries too, it's being used as yet the latest form of denialism, is net zero by 2050 will save us, not without most of the heavy lifting being done in the next 9 years. So that I tie them together as being a shared but distinct set of threats that have common characteristics, including that lack of political will is the only reason we haven't solved both.
Thanks, Elizabeth. The next question is, will the fossil fuel treaty work?
It could. I mean, a fossil fuel treaty could work. I'd rather work on the existing agreements we've got rather than starting from scratch. So I'll say that the Paris Agreement can work. It would be good to layer in enforcement mechanisms, which we don't have now. And it's very important for us the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change is a good agreement, but without teeth. It said all the right things, and the Kyoto Protocol was good. And again, where we are now, I'd rather build with the tools we have. We have an ongoing annual conference of the parties. Now, if the conference of the parties decided from the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change that the next protocol is a divestment treaty, the next protocol is a treaty for fossil fuel essentially disarmament, but in terms of fossil fuels, that would be great. But I don't think it's going to be a practical possibility to create a new negotiation forum. And we made the Paris Agreement was a triumph given the obstacles, but the lack of an enforcement mechanism makes it very difficult.
Thanks, Elizabeth. The next question I have here is, can national security change to personal security and then link to climate change? I'll repeat, can national security change to personal security and then link to climate change?
I guess I'd like to ask the question of why I don't think we need to do that. I mean, national security and global security threats need to be recognized. And let's face it, governments around the world mobilize far faster when they think there's a security threat than when they think we're about to destroy ourselves through ecological evaporation. I mean, when you think back to 9/11, Canada committed $9 billion in the blink of an eye to more security all over the place, including you can't bring a tube of toothpaste on board an airplane. Oh, we just went to we didn't think twice when it was framed as a security threat. The climate crisis has been seen for more than more than a decade and a half now, since I've seen the Pentagon and the UK security types and the military around the world. And particularly, by the way, I think security is a lens which the People's Republic of China definitely sees climate change as a security threat. I mean, if we lose as a planet, the Tibetan Plateau, what's sometimes referred to as the third pole, the ice on the Tibetan Plateau, if we lose that because of global warming, it means that major rivers of Asia, 8 major rivers, dry up. If you're in the Central Committee of the People's Republic of China, you see the climate crisis as a security threat. In Canada, we're still kind of naive about all this. So the idea that we'll sort of blunder through and we'll reduce emissions a bit, will be better than if the Liberals seem to think that as long as they're doing better than the Conservatives would have done, that's enough of a bar to cross it. That it has to be grounded in the science, that the emissions cuts have to be sufficient to imagine that we can live within our carbon budget and reduce emissions fast enough such that we have good odds. I mean, at this point, we don't get guarantees. Even with massive efforts, we'll have no guarantees, but good odds that human civilization will get through the oncoming, unstoppable, increased incidence of severe and damaging extreme weather events. We can't make things better. I mean, I think one of the great lines of all times, and I'm sorry I don't want to be depressing, but Al Gore said this about, I don't know how long ago, I think it was in 2006, when the Inconvenient Truth, when his movie came out, he said, if we don't act soon, now this was before I was in politics, I was still in the Sierra Club, Al Gore would say, if we don't act soon, it's going to be climate change. It's going to be kind of like a nature walk, the book of Revelations. Oh, so I think of that now. We got plague, we got fire, we got flood. Just had a call from my stepdaughter up at my husband's farm in Ashcroft. There's another fire. Then we know what that means now, because that means the smoke sinks down in the valley and nobody's going to be going in. We're getting used to this as an annual event that used to be a nightmarish, there's a fire every 30, 40 years. It's so bad that nobody can breathe. We're in the nature walk through the book of Revelations now. We can't turn any crank back to, let's have that nice, friendly climate we had in the 1950s and 60s and 70s. We're in it now. And what we have to do is fight like hell to hang on to enough capacity within nations to respond to extreme climate events and save species and save ecosystems and save lives by making firm commitments under a national security lens to say, we're not burning fossil fuels anymore. We can't build any new fossil fuel infrastructure. We can't build any new pipelines. We're going to be phasing down like this in our use of fossil fuels. Sure, we're going to be using some in 2050, but we're going to go on this kind of trajectory. And that's, and actually I didn't do actually the curve has to be more like this. We've got a sharp down before 2030 and leveling out till 2050 and off fossil fuels as fast as possible.
I've been on planet long enough to notice, obviously, the great difference, even looking at the sky now is from the time I was growing up to what it is today.
Yeah.
The next question, has the pandemic helped heighten political will for climate change?
Has the pandemic?
Yes.
Okay, I think that's an open question. One thing I hope that COVID may have done, and I say this with cautious optimism, is we may have seen the end of neoliberalism. The idea that the private sector does everything better than governments and the public sphere. That really, why would you ask government to move fast? We know government can't work. You know, the old joke of people like Stephen Harper, I'm here, I'm from Ottawa, I'm here to help, right? Where Ronald Reagan said, I'm here from Washington, I'm here to help. Yeah, I don't think we were out on our balconies banging pots and pans to celebrate the billionaire class. We were celebrating underpaid, overworked frontline workers. I think our attitudes towards wealth and the private sector have shifted whether we know it or not. Now, that also means that for a generation of people my daughter's age, they've never seen government move fast. I'm in the generation that, although I was born in '54, so but I'm in the last generation that grew up with family stories of the Depression, the Second World War, the mobilization of governments, what you do when you're serious about a crisis. The stories that are, of course, in Lester Brown's book, There Is No Planet B, of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, when the US finally decided it was in the war, calling in the car makers and saying, I need you to make tanks. And they tell them, well, we're making money making cars, thanks very much. And then passing a law that says making cars is illegal, you're making tanks. I mean, the impact of the late 1980s and the advent of neoliberalism essentially captured the narrative of what a government could do if a government wanted to do it, what a democracy could do if a democracy wanted to do it. So I think that the pandemic may have, I hope, changed perceptions about what's possible. What is appalling to me is the incrementalism coming out of Environment Canada and the Ministry of Environment now with Bill C-12. Of course, today's lecture, I should have mentioned, of course, global accountability. We have now in Canada and we're now in committee and they're pushing it through as fast as they can. We had our first committee hearing yesterday morning, and they announced that all amendments are due in by May 21st, and we end of this week, and then we're going to be in clause by clause by next Tuesday. Talk about not having enough time to actually hear from a lot of experts. But we have a Climate Accountability Act that's essentially a joke. It ignores the strong legislation that the United Kingdom brought in 2008, that New Zealand brought in just last year. And when I asked the minister yesterday in committee, why was the decision made? I wasn't personalizing about it because I think he actually means very well, but why was the decision? It was clearly made not to follow the models of laws around the world that have worked. And he said, oh, we looked at it, we considered those laws that worked, and we decided we needed a uniquely Canadian approach, which I could have, ended his sentence for him, which won't work. You've built it. So the climate accountability legislation in Canada, at a time when the pandemic should have emboldened our government to know, in an emergency, pick up the tools we need and do the job. And it's as if this law came out of a public relations agency to make it look like there was something being done on climate when they really wouldn't have to do anything at all.
Thanks, Elizabeth. The next question comes from Christine Peringer. I hope I got the name right. pronunciation right. Do you see the UNFCCC negotiations and subsequent stocktake discussions as useful?
Oh,
If,
oh yes,
if
yes.
so, what changes are needed to make them more effective?
Well, I don't know where we'd be without them, but again, and this is a statement of massive failure, and I feel a sense of personal failure because I've been working on the climate issue since I went to work in the Ministry of Environment's office in 1986, and I was part of very, very early discussions and deliberations to create the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change coming out of the 1988 conference that I already mentioned that was in Toronto. And when we met in Rio and accepted the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which I knew was too weak at the time, but thought, okay, we will fortify it in the protocol negotiations to come. I would, if anyone had told me then what I now know, I don't know if I would have, how I would have functioned. But we have emitted more greenhouse gases as economies around the world, as societies around the world, since 1990 till now, than we did before the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, right up till 1990. So at a time when all world governments and individual nations accepted the climate science, because that was at the essence of the UNFCCC, we accepted the science that we have to reduce emissions, we committed to reduce emissions. Canada is now 20% plus above where we were in 1990. Now, most of the countries in the industrialized world that were within the Kyoto Protocol are well below their 1990 levels. Canada is an exception to the rule. We are the worst performer in the industrialized world in responding to the commitments we've taken. We're not just middle of the pack bad, we're the worst of those who ever said we would achieve emission reductions in 1992, in 1997. We have increased emissions solely because Alberta and Saskatchewan are the two provinces that have increased emissions so much that even with Ontario shutting down the coal-fired power plants and making a significant difference in reducing emissions, that reduction in emissions was overwhelmed by the increase of emissions from primarily from development of oil sands and expansion of fracking. So both of those being in the bracketed category of unconventional fossil fuels. In other words, you can't just poke a hole in the ground and get an oil well anymore. Maybe some places on the planet, but basically those easy to reach accessible places for oil are gone. And we're increasingly in a world of unconventional, which means you got to do stuff like frack. So Bakken Shale from North Dakota is fracked oil. Most of the so-called natural gas we're now getting for liquefied natural gas isn't the natural gas that you just, again, it's fracking, injecting at high pressure water and chemicals to break down fractured bedrock and then liberate the substance at the same time, liberating lots of methane gas. And in the case of the oil sands, it's not fracked, it's dug out and mined. And then there's in situ where you put a long pipe down and again, push hot water down to try to liberate this tarry substance that doesn't want to move, which is bitumen. So we're, if you're looking at the extraction methods, once you move to unconventional, the amount of energy in for energy output is it's the law of diminishing returns in real time. I think we all remember the Beverly Hillbillies, so that's always the image in my mind. Jed Clampett, and you get a guy. The energy in for energy return for that kind of oil was 1 ounce, one unit of energy in was 80 units of energy out. Now we're down to, 2 units of energy in for 3 units out. Sometimes it's a wash, 2 units of energy in for 2 units of energy out. It's really the law of diminishing returns. And that's why it really, I will say again, oil is dead. It does not make sense, particularly post-pandemic, if you're putting any effort into anything to do just on the profitability. Forget climate. These are sunset industries if there ever were sunsets. And they're also, of course, a threat to climate. They're also a threat to health. We can go on and on. So as you can see, I can go on and on. I'm sorry about that. Probably should take the next question.
Talking about on and on, I totally lost sense of time. Your this discussion has been so fascinating. It's now 8 o'clock, and we should have actually gone on to the next item, but I'm going to ask one last question. Don't you think we, civil society, need to push that they do a fossil fuel phase-out agreement?
Yeah, yes. I think we need to push for fossil fuel phase out, whether it's, I mean, we essentially, by adopting the Paris target, we've done that. Okay, so the Paris target is not, and I'm grateful for this opportunity, Norbert, because I haven't said it yet, what the Canadian media and the Canadian Liberal government call the Paris target is not the Paris target. So just be very clear, the 30% below 2005 levels by 2030 that Stephen Harper put in place 6 months before Paris, that Justin Trudeau left sitting there, is not the Paris target. It happens to be Canada's level of commitment. The Paris Agreement specifically says our goal is to hold to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Today, the International Energy Agency, and I really loved Keith Stewart at Greenpeace tweeted out, that ever so mainstream International Energy Agency just put out a full report that said, if we're going to hold to 1.5 degrees, no new oil and gas, no new infrastructure, no pipelines, no. So if we're talking about, we don't need to find a new agreement for civil society to demand phase out. By adhering to the 1.5 degree target, which Canada did when we signed and ratified the Paris Agreement, we now have additional information, the 2018 report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and now the International Energy Agency report, make it very, very clear there is no way to keep our Paris Agreement target with any more new sources of oil and gas, any new fossil fuel infrastructure, the continuation of fossil fuel subsidies, which we pledged to get rid of in 2009 under Harper, by the way, not to mention the 2 different elections where the Liberals had it in their campaign targets. We actually already have committed to fossil fuel phase out. It's just this degree of cognitive dissonance. I don't know how Justin Trudeau stands up straight without the dizziness and the vertigo created by holding 2 completely contradictory opinions at the same time. It's a tribute to something. Cognitive dissonance can't be easy to live with. I would be dizzy all the time. You cannot be a climate leader and build the TMX pipeline. Yes. You cannot, and you cannot be a climate leader and approve offshore oil and gas off the shores of Newfoundland and Labrador, which they did within the last 12 months. You have to be committed to a just transition for the workers so that every fossil fuel sector worker knows they are secure and will be able to pay their mortgages, while just like the asbestos workers of Quebec, they're told, your job is over. We have to phase this out in an orderly fashion. So by 2030, the oil sands shut down. Maybe by 2040, Hibernia shuts down. But you need to make it really clear on a schedule, and civil society and NGOs need to deliver, I think, something that looks a lot like tough love on the Trudeau Liberals. I'm afraid that a lot of those pushing for climate action, whether they're policy experts or environmental groups, and because we have this completely dysfunctional electoral system called first past the post, people are easily spooked to think, well, Trudeau's so much better than conservatives on climate. And I'm very fond of Justin Trudeau. When I say tough love, I mean it personally. I love him, but I'm tough on him because his own children's future is at stake here, and he knows it. And yet, it's too tough to move forward because Alberta, because Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers, because what? These are smart people in our cabinet. I will say that. They are kind, smart, decent human beings. What is wrong with them? If you know them, grab them by the shoulders and say, for the love of God and your own children, do what is required. Sign and ratify the convention to end nuclear weapons on this planet. and commit to no less than 60% reductions against 2005 levels by 2030, scrap Bill C-12, put in place the Canadian equivalent of the New Zealand law, the UK law, laws that actually work, and announce, just like Joe Biden. You know, I really would have preferred it if Justin Trudeau's first conversation with the new president wasn't to say, we really mind that you're stopping the Keystone Pipeline. He should have said, okay, good for you. You've scrapped Keystone. I'll see you and raise you one. We're canceling TMX. What else can we do together? Let's get this planet and this continent off fossil fuels as fast as possible. We're in a race. Let's start competing with each other to see which country can move fastest and which one of us can do the most with developing countries to provide the assistance that the global South will need to confront this crisis.
Thanks, Elizabeth. And my apologies to the dozens of people who have put questions in the chat box, and
I'll try to answer in the chat while you do the next things.
Okay, so I appreciate that. Over to you, Rose.
Okay, Elizabeth, that was such an interesting and stimulating talk. I certainly learned a lot, and I'm sure many other people have as well. I think you've impressed upon us all how urgent it is for us to address the climate crises, and definitely inspired us to action. I've seen all kinds of entries in the chat, which I assume you'll deal with, as you've just pointed out, about how people can get more involved and do more. And just as an aside, there's a Climate Action Network that I know you support and work alongside, who are part of an international movement attempting to monitor what's going on and what more needs to be done to especially toughen up Bill C-12, as you pointed out, now in second reading in the House. And and we all have members of Parliament. We can call and bug and ask what their position is on this, and try and remember some of the things Elizabeth said and impart them to your local MP. Thanks.
Thanks, Rose. So I've got a few announcements to make. First, upcoming events. Our next event is on Wednesday, September 15th at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Guy Dunsey will be talking on the economics of kindness, a 10-year transition to a green cooperative economy. Guy Dunsey is an economist and a futurist who works to develop a positive vision of a sustainable future and to translate that vision into action. He is the author of many books, including Journey to the Future, A Better World is Possible. Then, on Wednesday, October 13th at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time again, Christine Perenger, again, I hope I got her name pronounced right, will be talking about better climate governance. Here to introduce herself, and the topic is Christine. Christine?
Thank you, and you're pronouncing it perfectly. I've been a member of World Federalists for 35 years. I work as a professional facilitator and a mediator. And I found myself, I'm also a member of Mediators Beyond Borders International. So I was part of their observer delegation going to my first climate change negotiations in 2019 in Bonn. And I was shocked at how, even though I was familiar with UN processes, I was really shocked at how slow the conversation was and how outside we could hear the voices of Fridays for Future, and the contrast between those two was so remarkable. And I've commented somebody recently that the process seemed medieval. Like I would never be hired as a professional facilitator if I ran my meetings the way these meetings run. So much is at stake. It was just painful to me to watch. And I was actually talking to a former UN climate change secretariat staff member, and he said, yes, medieval, a combination of mediocre and evil. And I found that kind of humorous, if it wasn't so sad. Anyway, as of going there, I struck up a relationship with a professor from Newcastle University, and long story short, we have together created a better climate governance project. You can learn about it at betterclimategovernance.com. And this is a World Federalist project, World Federalist Canada project, and Newcastle partnership. We've produced several papers looking at how mediation and facilitation approaches could be used to improve the negotiations within the UNFCCC. We held a conference April 19th. Anyway, all that to say that on October 13th, I will be hosting a discussion, sharing the results of the conference, the papers that we did, and having a conversation about how to improve climate governance. Very inspired by what Elizabeth May has said today, and hoping to learn more about what she has said in order to incorporate that in our discussions in October. And thanks for the invitation.
Thank you, Christine. Continuing with the announcements, the World Federalist Movement Canada Toronto branch is seeking volunteers to help with maintaining and developing our social media platforms, such as our website, Facebook page, Instagram, etc. 2, administrative work like maintaining our membership records. 3, planning, developing, and running events such as this one, and any other volunteer work you can offer. If interested, please email info@wfmc-toronto.org. That's info at, John, can you put that in the chat, please? info@wfmc-toronto.org. The first person to volunteer will receive a prize, a ticket to a 3-day virtual global conference hosted by World Beyond War. More on this when we get to the Q&A session on World Federalism. For anyone who's unable to stay on for our Q&A session on World Federalism, to learn more about the movement and the organization, you can visit our site. The cost of possibly join us. The cost of membership is $60 per individual, and it's reduced to $15 for students and others with limited income. Before we get on to the Q&A about the World Federalists, tell us a little bit about the prize. For the first volunteer, here is John Cohen, our treasurer.
Thanks, Norbert. Yes, we're always looking for volunteers, and we have a special incentive to a free ticket to the 3 afternoon or evening event organized by the World Beyond War, a relatively new anti-war information and advocacy group. Their annual conference, virtually, of course, is in about 2 weeks, June 4th to 6th, on evenings and afternoons, and it's really focused on stopping military spending. So it will include speeches and panels and discussions and booths and networking, and the first person to volunteer with the Toronto branch of World Federalists will get a free ticket to that event.
Thanks, John. We've now reached the Q&A section. To answer your questions, we have with us distinguished panelists, Professor Walter Dorn, President of the National World Federalist Movement, Canada, and Fergus Watt, the Executive Director of the National Organization. At the bottom of your Zoom window, you can see a reactions button. Clicking on it will bring up a bunch of options, including a raise hand button. Please click on this button to ask a question and click on the lower hand button when done. You may also continue to ask the questions in the chat, and the moderator will ask them for you. To kick off this section, I will ask the first question to Dr. Walter Dorn. Give us a very brief history of the World Federalist Movement. Why was it started, and what has it achieved?
Thanks, Norbert. The World Federalist Movement came out of a desire from people who saw the damaging effects of world wars. They realized that there had to be structures that would prevent nations from doing the insane things like threatening each other's populations. And it has origins in the League of Nations movement and unions and League to Enforce Peace in just prior to the creation of the League. Then in the 1930s, an effort to try and make the League of Nations effective, but it was an unsuccessful effort. And then pushing for a United Nations. And so these civil society movements were so crucial at key moments of creating the international institutions that we have today. But the same goals that they had in creating the League and the United Nations, we realized the goals are still so far away. And in the 1950s and 60s, the World Federalist movement realized that we needed stronger international enforcement. And of course, Elizabeth has referred to that. She referred to how the trade treaties have strong enforcement mechanisms, but it's lacking in other areas. And so the World Federalists wanted world peace through world law. They wanted stronger international institutions and realized that the only way to actually bind governments is to bind them in a federation where they had responsibilities and the federation could enforce and regulate the behavior of nations. And so we have this idea of world federalism. Now, some people think it's just world government, but it's not world government. We're looking at a level of governance on the globe, a global governance, where there is binding on nation states, binding legislation through an eventual parliamentary assembly or some other world body. But we're not looking for all power to be concentrated in one person's hands. We're looking for checks and balances in the long term and in the medium term to create the means that we can continue to exist by dealing with the problems that Elizabeth has so eloquently described to us and pointed the way to solutions. That is finding a way to rid the world of nuclear weapons and to solve the climate emergency.
Thanks, Walter. Anyone wish to raise their hand and ask a question? Or you can put questions in the chat as well.
Or they could unmute themselves.
Oh,
Unmute?
yes. Yes, you could unmute yourselves and speak.
Who's speaking? I am? Okay.
Go ahead.
So I was wondering that, I mean, social media is so effective on getting messages out. Is there anyone, or how would one use social media to get the message out? It's all
Walter?
very well for all these committees and so on to meet, but you know, the general public has to feel it and realize.
So I'll give a first attempt at answering. I feel a little bit like a hypocrite in answering because I think social media is extremely important and I wish I did more of it. I only tweet about once a month or so, and I think we should be much more engaged, and hence it makes a lot of sense for the Toronto branch to look for help for some people who are knowledgeable in that area. We have to have our voices heard. We need to make them, as Elizabeth had said in the chat, we need to reach out to our members of parliament, and we need to also inform the media through the op-eds and through letters to the newspapers. And indeed, a form of social media is responding to articles that you see in newspapers. So, you know, get the courage to write your views and to speak boldly, just like Elizabeth does. I think that's very important.
Okay,
Thanks,
several times it's been mentioned, writing letters to the editor. These people are flooded with letters every day that they want to get into the newspaper. So what kind of, you need a hook, and what kind of a hook can you suggest that one could use to actually get your letter into the paper?
Right, so my quick answer is you need to respond to current news. So find out what's in the news and either praise it or criticize it. And then be constructive oriented. I mean, I think it's very important that we be able to have an alternative just to the flood of criticisms or flood of bad news. We can actually give a better vision for the future. And if there's enough people writing letters, then the newspapers or the media sites will publish some of them because they see that there's so much interest in that area. So I would say, keep it up. And I'm also giving myself a little kick to start to do more in that area.
Well, we subscribe to the Globe and Mail, but what's in the news these days is Israel, COVID. Those are the main stories. So
I find there's a World Federalist angle on every issue because every issue is a global issue. What Israel and the Palestinians are doing are violations of human rights, and we need to create enforceable human rights standards. COVID is a global pandemic, and it requires that the World Health Organization be strengthened, that it has investigative powers, that we increase the international health regulations that were last updated in 2005. So all these are global problems that require global solutions.
To add to what Walter said, we've got to keep in mind that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is not the only conflict that's going on. We've got a terrible situation that's going on in Myanmar where hundreds of people have died. We've got a situation happening in the Tigray region, which is also of obvious concern. So these are all problems that can only be resolved through a global solution. Any other questions? Take yourself off mute and you can ask.
Well, one of the questions I have is that, do you know that the Californian breadbasket, they've used up all their water, their aquifer is nearly dry, and that's where our food comes from. And nobody's talking about it, Walter, and all of my friends there. On the media, they're just ignoring it. So that's food security in a big, big way. Back to you. What can we do?
Either, would you like to speak to it, Walter, or maybe even Elizabeth may want to speak to it?
Oh, if Elizabeth is there, please, I'd much rather hear her than me.
Well, I was enjoying listening to you, Walter. I was just answering a question in the chat, so forgive me. Just again, would you repeat the question?
Julia Morton-Marr, maybe I'll summarize. She's talking about the aquifers in California and how they're running dry. And
yeah, I did hear that question. I'm sorry. Yeah, no, people are talking about it. Globally, groundwater resources are being over exploited. We have a real water crisis, and the climate crisis precedes, and the water crisis comes along right with it. So people are talking about it, but we need to do much more in talking about what people sometimes describe now as green infrastructure. We need to protect wetlands. We need to be very mindful that we can't make any new water. What we have is what we'll always have. And the overexploitation of water resources is a real threat. And we know right now, I mean, the prairie farmers are already warning how dry they are. They are in real terms, they're drier than dust bowl conditions, but their exploitation of irrigation masks the problem. But we're in a real water crisis as well.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Question from Rose Dyson to Walter and Fergus. How can we help address what Elizabeth has laid out as an urgent national security issue in the climate crisis on a national level? Should we be revisiting the terms of the Montreal Protocol?
I'll first go at it very quickly, and Fergus, please jump in. So I think Elizabeth has given us some very good recommendations. We should follow up on that. I'm working in the security field. I teach military officers, and we talk about securitization. And usually we speak about it in a negative fashion, that we say, you shouldn't over securitize things, the war on drugs, the war on this. But creating a response to the climate emergency, I think, is a very responsible thing to do. It's a securitization that needs to be done. It will bring about greater attention, and I hope that our military comes to the same conclusions that the Pentagon has, that that actually it is an important function of the military to help deal with climate change. So raising awareness is key. And I think as World Federalists, we can do a lot more in the environmental area. And so my plea to people who have expertise in this is please join us and help us so that we can have the World Federalist movement be a stronger voice for the environment.
Yeah, Norbert, I would suggest that I don't think there's a single answer to how we can make enforcement of reductions to meet climate goals. I think there's a number of global governance approaches that are viable. Elizabeth spent a lot of time talking about sanctions approaches. She also mentioned that the Framework Convention on Climate Change was a fairly weak instrument when it was negotiated. At the time, there was a lot of legal opinion that supported the idea of the climate and the atmosphere as being defined legally as humanity's common heritage, as was done in the Law of the Sea Convention, and that would have given a stronger legal basis for a convention moving forward, but that was not possible at the time. So the Framework Convention was the treaty that we got. More recently, there is interest in a global pact for the environment. The UN just went through 2 years of negotiations on a broad umbrella agreement that would bring together climate change, biodiversity, desertification, and a number of environmental agreements to plug holes in some of the existing international environmental law. That's a partial solution as well. And also there's rights-based approaches that can contribute. Particularly a growing area is intergenerational human rights and trying to build up human rights law. So there's a variety of legal tools, I think that as the climate emergency becomes more acute, as we know, Paris requires increasing ambition as we move towards 2030, and that's going to increase pressure to also access some of these additional legal international law tools.
Thanks, Fergus. There's a question from Dorothy Goldham Rosenberg. Mark,
do you want me to speak?
Yes, please. Go ahead.
Okay. Hi, Elizabeth. I know that you know a lot about small modular nuclear reactors. My comment in there was Mark Carney has invested in in a company in small modular nuclear reactors, and I wondered if you could say something about that as an excuse for climate change, and we'd call it a dangerous, dirty distraction.
Yeah, Dorothy, lovely to see you. Sort of, I almost see you, but I don't know that he has. So that I will check into. Mark Carney, as I have, unlike the Bill Gates book on climate, which was really quite difficult to read, but at least he's saying climate is real and he may reach people who otherwise wouldn't think so. But it wasn't. I mean, Mark Carney, Bill Gates' book was a series of things of, I just invested in this technology, I just invested in that technology. So I know that Bill Gates is definitely promoting small modular reactors. There is no such thing as small modular reactors. It's an entirely, it's a marketing scheme. Yes, there's a theory that they can build smaller reactors, but there's nothing about them that makes them benign. And I'm sure Doug Roach would say, if he was jumping in on this as well, that anything that involves trade and development of so-called civilian use of nuclear energy plays into nuclear proliferation, but especially this one that they've just invested in. The government of Canada has put $50 million into the New Brunswick government and Point Lepreau, which is a Point Lepreau, those will all remember, was an old AECL 600 megawatt heavy water reactor in New Brunswick. They're now going to go. This is the stuff of nightmares. A company that's never built as a molten salt reactor, because no one's ever built a molten salt reactor. Okay, this exists in theory. They want to build a molten salt reactor in New Brunswick, where they will get the fuel by going into the spent fuel, the fuel rods of Point Lepreau, which is very, very dangerous fuel. They're going to go in and take plutonium out of the spent fuel to create a molten salt reactor. This is all the stuff of experimentation, unproven, and of course, it's highly dangerous, particularly in terms of terrorism, because very, very small amounts of plutonium could be in a dirty bomb and hold a city hostage with the threat of it. This is not the thing for New Brunswick Power to be undertaking. This is nightmarish, and we're being sold on it. And I don't know who writes the lines for Seamus O'Regan, but I'm sure it's the same people in what's now Natural Resources Canada, but used to be Energy, Mines and Resources, that got taken over by the nuclear industry in the 70s and the 80s, and they're still there just the way. So the provinces that want nukes are the provinces which deeply embedded in the decision-making of the Ontario government or the New Brunswick government or the Saskatchewan government. Saskatchewan is deeply pro-nuclear because it's done uranium mining for years. And New Brunswick is pro-nuclear because it's had Point Lepreau, and it's in violation of advice from its own Public Utilities Commission. It wasted hundreds of millions of dollars, if not billions, on new retubing the fuel rods of Point Lepreau. So make no mistake, the nuclear industry is trying to use the climate crisis as its last gasp that that it might be needed somewhere. It's needed nowhere.
And the billions going into that should be going into the things that we need, like energy efficiency, conservation, renewables, what we call the low-hanging fruit that we need right now to deal with climate and everything else.
Well, Dorothy, you and I have been doing this so long that we were that low-hanging fruit. We've been talking about it since the 1970s. We should be making wine by now. We've been stomping all over the low-hanging fruit for decades. It's just, it's a travesty.
But there are a lot of new people who aren't aware of it. So we have to keep repeating it to say, and we've got a very good group, as you know, this small modular new nuclear reactors. It's a group that's being led by wonderful people in the Maritimes. They're just fantastic. And we meet every Friday, and they're writing letters to the editor, and they're making a lot and lots of articles actually in the Hill Times. And yet this government does not want to hear.
No, and of course, that Jenica Atwin, who's my colleague in the Green Party, who's the MP for Fredericton, she's been hosting webinars and things, and Susan O'Donnell. So I won't go on and on about it, but we completely agree, Dorothy, and it does tie in. It ties into the movement against nuclear weapons. It ties into the misappropriation of the climate issue by those who want to promote nuclear reactors.
Thanks.
There's a question from Julia Morton Marr. Julia, you might want to ask the question. And everybody, if you've got any questions on world federalism, please ask them as well. Julia, do you want to? Julia Morton Marr says population must be discussed.
Yes, we're not discussing. I've been part of Helmut Burkhardt's and the Global Issues Project with Science for Peace for a very long time, since 1966, and EWOC, the Evolution of World Order. And we did discuss population and food at one of our roundtables, Elizabeth, and we seem to have dropped that because it's so difficult.
Well, so I didn't mean to cut you off, Julia, but the Greens are the only party in the country that I know of that has a policy on population. And it's very tied to the reality that, that population by itself is not the problem. It's that formula of population and consumption and impact. So the minority of the human population, I mean, if you just took billionaires off the planet, let's send them to Mars now and it's a one-way ticket. Well, then you end up reducing a lot of resource use. I mean, it's amazing how much billionaires consume. So but the global population is obviously an issue, and it's best dealt with, and the Green Party policies, or you can find them on the website somewhere. Our document Vision Green is still there somewhere, but I
Okay.
hate websites. I have trouble finding. But but our policy is basically empowering women and girls, education for women and girls, healthcare for women and girls, and economic and political autonomy for women and girls, and you get reduced fertility.
Yes, I agree.
Okay, there's a question here regarding the new executive director position. Fergus, you want to talk about that a bit? Fergus is retiring and we're looking for a new executive director.
Well, I've been captured by a project looking for ways to strengthen the UN and build on the 75th anniversary of the United Nations, and it's been going well. And there is we're anticipating a report from the UN Secretary General on following up the UN 75 declaration that will set in motion a process, an intergovernmental process, and so we're quite excited about that. But what it's done is really sort of push the question about the succession of the leadership of the World Federalists in Canada to the fore, and so as of the 1st of July, I'll be stepping back as executive director, and there's a very typical committee process seeking to hire a new executive director of the World Federalists, and so we'll see what that brings.
Fergus, I just have to say I didn't know, and thank you for all the years of service to World Federalists. You've done a fantastic job. We've been working together for, I forget now, but I don't think you're going to be replaceable you're not going to be replaced very easily.
Well, thank you, Elizabeth. And I never get tired of the story about Norman Cousins, and, and you've been a World Federalist longer than I have.
Well, Fergus knows this. I actually started a World Federalist Club in my grade 1 class at school. And we really didn't have much to do. So I invented an enemy of the other kids at school. We pretended they were in the John Birch Society, so that we had a kind of a, it was a more progressive version of Cowboys and Indians, but no more sophisticated than what the other kids were playing.
Francis Tremblay has a question. Francis, do you want to ask the question?
I just want to say, Elizabeth, that you, in the bio you sent me, I didn't take the time to read through it all. It's fascinating that you grew up in the state of Connecticut. And that's where my grandson grew up, and he's plugged into this webinar. I hope he will be inspired knowing that you got your roots in World Federalism in that state as well.
Well, yeah, I grew up in the States, and my parents moved the whole family to Cape Breton Island in 1972, which many of you know all the stories, but it's lovely to see so many old friends on this call. I see a camera on for Tootie McLean, but I don't see Tootie, but I just want to send love. I'm afraid if I talk anymore, I'll be calling on people and just saying it's so nice to see you all. Thank you. I'm going to put myself on mute so you can actually have a proper conversation. But I really appreciate all the work that you're all doing on World Federalism issues and on the work against nuclear weapons proliferation. And the more that we can work together on climate change, I couldn't be more thrilled.
Thanks, Elizabeth. I'm going to read the question from Francis Tremblay. I think it's an important one. And I think Emily Ferguson has something similar. Does the World Federalist Movement have any campaigning activities to encourage younger generations of students to join the movement? We established the Global Federalist Association at the University of Toronto from 2017 to 2018, which attracted 16 to 18 members throughout the academic year. I've seen the Liberal Party establish the Young Liberals of Canada groups on university and college campuses across Quebec and Ontario. And I thought it would be a great way of getting students involved in the movement. If we replicate the model, perhaps this is something the Green Party would consider collaborating on. So I'll let Elizabeth talk about the Green Party, or I could do it myself. because anyway, I'll let Elizabeth talk about the Green Party, but for the World Federalist Movement, I'd like to say that we are trying to get as many of the younger generation as possible. I've tried to contact the universities, for example, to announce this event. And I find that at least my experience has been that the universities don't want to get involved in to promote politics or something of that sort. So when I've been able to find pockets, for example, in Ryerson they have a forum on social democracy. I'm able to contact them, but it is a challenge to meet the right people in the university.
Norbert, if I can jump in here as well,
please.
I just put a link in the chat. There is a new organization called the Young World Federalists, they're organized globally, for one thing. So some of our our typical old school World Federalist structures organizing around city-based branches and national organizations are probably soon going to be a casualty of the pandemic and Zoom and different modes of communication. But there is this group that is sort of organized across the world, and that they're on they use Discord and various social media, and it's probably a year and a half old now, but something that Emily could check out.
Thanks, Francis. I'm hoping that I'll be able to have a conversation with you online. To me, this is an important thing to get younger people involved in the World Federalist Movement, and I certainly want to explore that. I think I might have your email address from the Zoom invitation. I'll try to find it there. From Emily Ferguson, how do we get those under 50 active on these issues? As a 32-year-old mom, I worry these important discussions are not reaching my generation, and we are all raising children in a time of such consequence. Emily, if you don't mind, I'll reach out to you as well. I'd like to see what we can do there. Elizabeth, I've got a question for you, if I may. I'm interested to know what about the Global Greens, the parliamentarians. Can you tell us a little bit about that? Because I see that as a means by which people from around the world can coalesce on issues that are important to us.
Yeah, thank you for asking. We have a Global Greens COP26 working group, and with the postponing of COP26 for a whole year due to COVID, we've been meeting more on Zoom. But the Global Greens Parliamentarians Association is one of the things that really encourages me in all of my work at different levels. There are over 400 elected Greens at the national level in countries and parliaments around the world, and we do work together. And we've been focusing more on this question because I've raised it, and of what do we do to get the tools we need to make the agreements effective? Can we confront the World Trade Organization? Can we talk about that? The Greens it's an interesting way of working because some of my colleagues in Green parties around the world are also in government, sometimes in coalition governments, sometimes in governments that are called confidence and supply agreements, such as in 2017, it was the New Zealand Greens who put Jacinda Ardern in as the Prime Minister of New Zealand, and they weren't a coalition government. They were the same form of government, for those of you who are familiar with what we had in BC, until John Horgan called a snap election last fall, was a confidence and supply agreement. But New Zealand Greens actually negotiated a confidence and supply agreement within which there were cabinet seats for Greens. So the co-leader of the New Zealand Greens is the Minister of Climate from New Zealand. But same thing for Sweden. When you go to global negotiations, and I pick up on the points that were made earlier about the ways in which it seems that these negotiations are unwieldy and mediocre, but I love the UN system for one thing particularly, which is that negotiations are by consensus. So little tiny Tuvalu can hold up a global agreement when the bigger polluters want to push something through and they say, no, 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 we're not coming. So one country in theory can stop a bad agreement in a UN session, although it usually takes a lot more to actually make the chair refuse to hit the gavel and say, you know, the agreement has been reached. But for global greens, when we're working together at climate negotiations, generally 4 to 6 of us are in the negotiations as governments doing the negotiation, and another 30 of us or whatever are in the negotiations but not able to negotiate on behalf of our governments, and another couple of hundred are outside in the streets. So when you get together to strategize, you've got a lot of different perspectives to bring to how are the negotiations actually going. And also lets you say, okay, if you're inside your delegation, you can go back out and say to, like as I have done to the Canadian government, you've got this wrong. I just talked to the minister for, I mean, this is the kind of conversation you don't have in the media. I just talked to the minister for Sweden, and they don't think that such and such country is the bloc. They think it's really, so a lot of the greasing the gears for negotiations is made much more possible by the fact that we work together. And the more that Greens do well anywhere, I always say Greens doing well anywhere helps Greens do well everywhere. So the Scottish Greens just elected 8 members of the Scottish Parliament. They've never had 8 before. By the way, the co-leader of the Scottish Greens, Lorna Slater, was born in Canada. And of course, the leader of the PEI Greens is the official opposition in the Prince Edward Island government is the Greens. Peter Bevan Baker was born in Scotland. So we sort of feel like there's some kind of karma there. But I probably told you more than you wanted to hear, Norbert. That we also have elected Greens in the Rwandan Greens hold seats in Parliament, Burundi, lots of Greens in many countries in the developing world. So we strive just the way the UN would do to have north-south balance in our discussions. And if you go to the Global Greens website, we've had some really good public webinars with elected Greens talking about what our hopes are for COP26 in Glasgow in November.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Any other questions?
Well, Norbert, there were a number of questions that we skipped over earlier because the official time with Elizabeth had expired. You could go back if you wish, and if we still had time with Elizabeth, back through some of the other ones, such as the one Douglas Roche asked, but I don't think he's on the line any longer.
Okay. Do you want to ask the questions, John?
Well, is Elizabeth still up for it?
Elizabeth, are you okay to take a few questions?
I'm sorry, I said sure, but I didn't take my mute off.
Okay.
Sure, I could do another question or two. I have to go in the next 10 minutes, but I'm fine for 10 minutes.
Thanks,
So
Elizabeth. Hi, John.
Douglas Roche, our esteemed past senator, the Honorable Douglas Roche, wrote, do you think the political order can understand that a global ethic is necessary to make a common agenda for intersecting problems?
I think so. And I think particularly in Canada. I mean, it's harder in the US because they've got a much less internationalist citizenry. Canadians, I think, still, even in the younger generations, and younger generations for different reasons, resonate to the notion of the planet as a whole and being planetary citizens. I think for older generations, we actually remember Lester B. Pearson and the winning a Nobel Peace Prize and developing the peacekeeping forces. It's lost in history for some people, but there's a lot of support for the reality that, as Fergus was saying earlier on another issue, global problems require global solutions.
There's another question from Christine Peringer. Where are the most inclusive conversations taking place to address climate change? Elizabeth?
Frozen.
Did we lose her?
I think the screen's frozen.
Uh-oh, I guess we lost her.
Yeah, maybe
Unmute her.
maybe Fergus can handle that one. And also, in the meantime, there was a question in the chat earlier that I thought it was pretty relevant to what we try to do as the World Federalist branch. How do we relate World Federalist principles to the common individual?
Who wants
Well,
to take that?
I'll say a few words and Fergus, please jump in. We are all human beings. We live on a planet for which there is no natural demarcation of borders through dotted lines on our surface. Nature views the planet in a whole fashion and a holistic fashion. And so we've managed in human history to create means to govern ourselves at the municipal level, the provincial level, the national level, but we still have to govern ourselves on the global level. So let's find ways that we can get together, breaking the bonds of nationalism, especially narrow-minded nationalism, and find a way that we can, as one humanity, speak for the interests of all of humanity.
Thanks, Walter.
I would suggest that this is an area that is where we should be particularly optimistic. I think that particularly with young people today, but there is a growing sense of global citizenship, of connectedness, and this has only increased with the pandemic. I think that the political knock-on effects from this growing global citizenship and connectedness will have some positive impacts in the next decade. I think there's just a different sense of civic awareness and citizenship among people that is transcending nationalism. I think that we're seeing this, whether it's, a colleague mentioned social media earlier, and there's all kinds of connections in terms of global economies and an awareness that national governments alone are just not delivering on the global public goods that are so important, like climate and international security and peacekeeping and so on and so on.
Can I just say something? It's Dorothy here. I want to say, Fergus, to you, how I have always associated the World Federalists with you. We first met in the 80s when I was the Disarmament and Development Coordinator at the Canadian Council for International Cooperation. I can't imagine that organization without you. You have done such a magnificent job all these years, and it's been a consistent, wonderful job. And I remember you from the 80s. So I just wanted to say that I really appreciate everything you've done, and I'm sorry that you will not be, but I'm sure you're going to be very, very involved still. So I just want to wish you the best.
Well, thank you, Dorothy, and it's great to see you again. I must say I consider myself lucky to have been able to have a career immersed in World Federalist ideas and ideals. Politics consists in large part of ideas, and ideas are bigger and more powerful than any one individual. And as World Federalists, we're custodians of a very important set of ideas for world community. And I have no doubt that the organization will can carry on and thrive without me. but thank you for saying that.
Let's give cheers to Fergus for the great job he's done. Thank you, Fergus. We all appreciate it.
Yeah.
And on that note, we're coming to the top of the hour. I'd like to remind everyone of the two events we have. The one on September 15th with Guy Duancey, and October 13th with Christine Peringer. Also to remind you to visit our website to check out more on World Federalism and possibly become a member. I would like to, did I miss something? Yeah, and the volunteers, if you'd like to volunteer or for anything else you might want to contact us, you can email info@wfmc-toronto.com, which is in the chat. I'd like to thank Elizabeth, whom I believe has left the meeting because it's quite late. I'd like to thank Professor Walter Dorn and Rose Dyson for the introductions. John Cohen, who worked hard to make behind the scenes to make this event a success. Peter Venton for his contributions in developing the series, and to all of you who attended and participated in today's presentation. Thank you, everybody, and we look forward to seeing you at our next event. Bye now.
Thank you, Norbert. Good meeting.
Thank you. Bye.